Andrew, welcome to the show.
It's great to be with you, Vic. Hi.
I'm excited to have you on. I think the work you're doing and everything that you're up to, your book, and we're going to dive in some other things here, is just fascinating. And I'm really I want to pick your brain. So I'm excited to just have this next 40, 50 minutes here to really dive for the listeners to gain some really good life nuggets and wisdom that you're going to be sharing. So thanks for taking the time.
It's an absolute pleasure. Hi, everyone.
So, as my listeners know, I always start out when I interview somebody is I always want to hear your story. I'm always curious for myself and for the listeners of how you got into what you're doing today. A lot of times in life, I know for myself, I was always told you got to pick a path and go. And then when I started my path, it was like, yeah, I don't like that. I'm going over here. Yeah, that ain't it. I'm going over here. And I did this thing what I call the pinball effect. And so, kind of curious, where has your life lined up with everything that you're doing, and how you got up to what you're doing today?
Well, one of the first jobs I ever had in psychology was in psychiatric crisis teams, and so I'd be on bridges with people who are looking gloomily at the bottom of the bridge, or in siege situations with people with pretty dire moments, and that got me interested in how you stop people getting to that point in their lives, of course. And that then led me, of course, to start to study. This is probably over 35 years ago now. A word that wasn't very well known at that time, even though it's almost unimaginable now that's so, and that was the word resilience. In fact, when I started to research resilience, people would look a bit confused and talk about steel and tension, bridges and things like that. So it was kind of confusing. But so that then led to this really big wave of kind of how do you stop people getting to that point? And we did a large scale survey, which we've done a second wave of now, much later on, much more recently. But the first wave was talking particularly to young people who'd grown up really tough, and despite it, had turned their lives around. And what I was interested in, what was going on at that turning point. And they told me that three things really were potent as ingredients. The first one was having at least one member of your family who loves you to bits, really, who just thinks you're fantastic. So even in a really dysfunctional family, having one person who just thinks you're great makes the difference. It's not ideal, but it's enough. The second one was having a diversity of friendship groups. So should I fall out with one group of friends, I've got another group to kind of relate to. And the third one was having an adult outside their family, often a teacher or a coach or somebody who was a community member or a family friend who, and it was a really interesting bit of the research, who was able to look beyond the smoke screen of the teenager or young person's behavior at that point and say, "You're all right, Rick. You're the kind of person I like to know. Something about you. It's a glint in your eye. It's something, and they saw something in that young person that the young person wasn't able to see in themselves. And the more that we continued on doing interviews around that theme, it really became clear that those adults, often without really knowing it or intending to do so, gave those young people a gift that they'll spend the rest of their lives unwrapping. So that's really how it became that first wave of research. The second wave of research clarified it even further to suggest that basically what promotes resilience is that when we connect with one another, when we protect one another, and when we respect one another, people thrive. So there's sort of we connect, we protect, and we respect. So the CPR of well-being. So that's a kind of brief overview of it.
I love it. I was going in flashback as you were talking about the first part because I was sitting there. I'm like, having resilience in my upbringing and what I went through and so forth. And then I'm like, yep, I had a family member who thought the world of me. Always was happy to see me. Was always like, back then I was concerned about my looks. I was concerned about a lot of other things. And she'd be like, "You're so gorgeous. You're so this. You're so wonderful. You're so XYZ," right? And I was like, okay, that was a big supporter to keep me moving forward instead of going down a negative downward spiral. And then you mentioned someone who was near the family. I had someone who was like a second mother who, when I was a teenager, I'm sitting there. I wasn't trying to smile as much when you're saying it, because I'm like, oh my God, yeah, there was one of the lady who was responsible for getting my parents together to be married was also like, I call her my guardian angel, because when I was so infuriated with my parents because they wouldn't understand, I was just trying to express and they were not seeing my side, and I just wanted to be heard. And it was like, she would always be like, honey, sometimes, parents, they see only what they want and not what you want, and she would just like walk me, like, give me like a piece of like, okay, I just got to figure this out, and I'll get through this. And I think the other one was diversity of friends, which I had a lot of in high school. So very, very interesting to see when you're talking about that. It's like, oh my God, that's my life. Yep. That's exactly me there. So I wanted to share that because I thought it was pretty interesting.
Yeah.
When it comes to the work you've done, now you said over 500,000 people. Okay. What are some things? I mean, that's quite a lot of people there. What are some things that, you talk about resiliency and things like that, but what are some of the common things when it comes to individuals with their life that you share? Like, is there a common theme? I mean, I know we're going to get into like ages and stuff like that. I'm excited to go down that path with you. Maybe this may lead that way. So if it is, take it. When it comes to the work that you're doing and so forth, is there some things like you see as a commonality, or is that more like at different age brackets and so forth?
So I think life is an improvisational art, really, and we have to keep reinventing ourselves throughout our lives. And so what sometimes gets in the way of that, or sometimes facilitates it, is perhaps just to explain that a bit. So when you run workshops, large workshops with lots of people, one of the great privileges is that people do stuff for you, and so I would ask people to kind of map their lives and give me a kind of overview of their life, a pretty simple kind of, if you imagine a vertical axis being the happiest you've ever been or the unhappiest you've been, sort of like a 10 down to 0, and then basically across the horizontal you've got different ages, and you get people to map it and kind of look at it. And then sometimes I get them to map their parents and sometimes their lives as well. And what became really apparent through that and the interviews that I did was that families have time bombs. So that when you're when you're lying in that bassinet or that crib or that cradle or whatever cot or whatever you're in, looking cute and gorgeous and all of that, you are studying life with an absolute determination to work it out. And one of the things that you absorbed acutely, even though you couldn't speak and you weren't aware of it, was at what age do you do particular things? And so, because you're pre-verbal at this point of your life, you can have a consciousness which is not necessarily anything you can later on analyze unless you really think about it. And so there will be in almost every family set points, the sort of age at which you leave home, or the age at which you start a relationship, or the age at which you split up, or the age that you kind of have children, or become old or become frail. And starting to see those echo points in families, or basically those particular touch points or time bombs, is incredibly useful to do, because I think sometimes we all think that our life is our own creation and absolutely it's an individual thing, but human beings have been doing this thing called life for a long time, and so there have to be some patterns to it, I think, after all of those years. And of course within a family the patterns are even more powerful. And so often what I'll find is that when, for example, for you, perhaps if we give you an example, Vic, so you can kind of relate to this. If I ask you about your father, are you the youngest in your family, by the way?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So how old were you when your father was born?
How old was I when my dad was born?
Sorry.
I was like, wait a minute.
How old was your father when you were born? Whoa, got that rather wrong.
Let me see now. So he's 70. So he was 32.
32. Okay. And then there will be an event that occurred after your birth that changed your family. Now, maybe that was you going to school, but even before that, there may have been an event that happened that kind of changed his life. Yep. Would that be your school, or would it be something else?
Changed his life. So, so does that would it like an older sibling do that? Because I know, or
Could be.
would it have to be me? Because I know, like, my sister was a preemie when she was born. We called
Okay.
her a
Yep.
miracle baby. She died
Yep.
twice. Second time, the
Sure.
doctor said she wasn't going to make it. Like, just say your
Yeah.
prayers and that's it. And then they found out later on she was deaf, and they found that later. So, like, from that hardship of 4 months of being in the NICU and hoping that she survives and all that stuff, to then a year or so later, I think it was a little over a year later, they started to notice she wasn't really responding to noises, and then they did a test and found out she was deaf. So that
Wow.
was really detrimental to them. And then I come along, which I think I was not born the right way either. I always joke and say I was born on the wrong foot. And literally, my 2 feet, I was born with something called bilateral club foot, which means instead of you're
Wow.
looking down at your feet and seeing the top of them, what I'm
Yeah.
seeing is the inside bottom of my feet turning inward. And so, and then that led to, a whole plethora of things, corrections, and my mom had to strap me in bars, like Forrest Gump the movie. I didn't have them moving; I just had them when I slept. And I think that, like, those are like, how many more things do I have to deal with and keep fighting with him? How many? Why can't things just be
Yeah.
like normal? I think he never. My dad's not the type to talk, so it's not one of those things he will
Yeah.
ever express. Maybe down the road he will. Different stages in life, right? But yeah, so that's a little bit of the backstory. Probably a little bit too much you want to hear, but I just wanted to give
No.
you that full picture.
Well, your family's so full of time bombs. Of course, we probably need 4 podcasts to get through this, right? But so what the idea is that when you get to the age at the same age that your parents were when they had to confront all of those changes, often you will change your life in a fairly dramatic way. And it'd be interesting. We could ask you more if you want, but at the same time, it's a really interesting thing to think about. And just to think, okay, well, why am I changing things right now? And we'll often find that there's actually an echo point in one of your parents' lives at exactly the same age.
I can see that because at 32, my chiropractic office, we were in a small space, and I was tired of being. I was looking to get out of this small space, and I wanted to get a big office, and I had a big vision, and it was either continue where I was, but if I made this move, even my accountant looked at me and she goes, "The rent's way too high. Like, you don't do that. Like, there's rules to this, and you're going double of what the max is." I said, "We're going to double the business in 1 year. I have to do this. I just
Yeah.
can't stay where I'm at. This is not working for me. I have a bigger vision." And so at that moment, I chose to believe in myself even more. And all of a sudden we did with that year, we jumped 83%. The next year was like another 60. Overall it was like three
Wow.
times within those 2 years. I don't know if that
Fantastic.
relates. That's a
Yeah,
business side
no,
of things.
absolutely. That's
Okay.
exactly what I'm talking about. And so time bombs can be positive or negative. It's not a sort of one direction or the other. And so, but just being aware of them gives you a choice. So you don't necessarily want to replicate every time bomb that your family have. I says, for most families anyway. So there are some you go, oh, I don't know whether I need to repeat that pattern. Thank you very much. It was nice to get the message, but I don't need to do it. Whereas other ones you might want to capitalize on. But just being aware of them allows you to be free from basically that patterning in families. It's very, very interesting stuff.
Yeah, you got me thinking now because it's like, my dad was very successful at a young age. He was a workaholic, and being young and making good money, people told him, "Hey, buy land, do this, do that," and he did it all. His negative downfall was he was a gambler, and he basically one day, I mean, he just
Uh,
eventually gambled it all away. And I always share this story. I shared it in my book. I said it was one of the things where I appreciate him sharing that story. He really embedded that story into me. But at the same token, when I always look at him, I said, "But I wish you continued on and didn't make that failure be your life." Like, instead of marking that and say I failed and that's the end of it, wished he would have been like, because he's very gifted in a lot of things he does. And I was like, I wish he would have said, "You know what, that's fine." Because now you're making me think. Because at 32, I remember I was doing okay in the business, but I
hmm,
wasn't happy. Like, I wasn't living my life the way I wanted to. And I was like, either the space is holding me back, or I'm like, or I'm gonna have to just shift careers. I'm like, I don't know. This is not really like, I was like in the business now for like 3-4 years. And I'm like, it's not gelling like a lot of the mentors I'm following who are doing really, really well. And I'm doing everything they're doing, but it wasn't doing at that level. And I was like, there's something I'm missing here. And so it was at that pivot point where I was kind of like, all right, it's either I'm going all in on this new space and I'm going to put all my energy into it and give it my all, or it's not going to work. And then I'm going to have to redirect things. But I found that fascinating.
Yeah.
So in my work, there's always things called, I don't know if you use this word or not, but like ancestral curses. Now, this is something that like in a programming way, in chiropractic, we talk about this from genetic perspective, that when sperm and egg come together, I used to share this a lot, and now there's research that backs it up to say, when sperm and egg come together, all the experiences of your life at that time, from mom and dad, get transferred into there as like a survival mechanism, kind of saying, hey, here's how the world is. Here's what we went through. And it's more, I think it's more energetic. It's not like actual memories of all these things. It could be, there is cellular memory, they say, but that's a whole nother story. But does that play a role in some of this stuff too, in a sense, like, in where, or let me take that back. Why is it that we, as like, for me, just as one little example at 32 and my dad at 32, and another example of me at 28, which was another one with my parents having their kids, my sister. But is that why we see those time bombs? Is there any reasoning behind that?
So it would be really interesting to ask your dad, if you ever get a chance, about the age that he began to fritter away his gains, and then to look at his father and mother's patterns and see whether you get an ancestral echo, because that's often what will happen. So it'll be transferred down. And because, of course, these things are learned when we are not really verbal, we don't transform them, we just transmit them. And so one of the things that I often think in family, if we don't transform pain, we transmit it, and we transmit it down to the next generation. And so one of the things that we can really do to advantage our great grandchildren is to basically just do a bit of thinking about your own life and have a look at these patterns, not because everyone will necessarily have the same patterns, but you'll have some. And that will then give you greater empowerment over your life, really. And so, in a way, families are a bit like, those cookie cutters, I guess. They kind of want you to be the same kind of person too. That's the other force in a family. So I think everyone's had the experience of having a year of amazing change when they've been away from their family, and they go back home for a sort of family gathering, and people look at you and go, oh, you haven't changed a bit. You go, come on. Amazingly different. We're not seeing it. And so they do like to see you in that same role. And that's true for kids, but it's also true for adults, for parents as well. So quite often I'll work with women who basically, after a lifetime of caring for everybody else, finally need to start to look after themselves better. And what happens is that they start to do some really great stuff for themselves, but the family, without even ever really thinking about it, become a bit disapproving of, hang on, this is not how you normally are. You should get back into this old role that we're used to having. Thank you very much. They're a bit threatened by change. And I have to work with women to basically break through that, and because otherwise the guilt basically just forces them back into a sacrificial role.
I can relate to that 100%. And I think it's called, I don't know if it's the lobster or the craw effect. I think it's the lobster effect, where you have 3 lobsters in the tank. Have you ever heard this before? And then they, if one wants to get out, the other 2 are going to grab it by its legs and pull it back in. Yeah. And that's where I think the ancestral curse, when I heard this years ago, I was like, oh, what do you mean ancestral curses? And some people are like, it's not what you think, but it's a consciousness level. Everything has consciousness level. So the town you grew up in, the city, the state, the country, the world, humans in general, and you're bringing up a great point, and I love it. Where we look at like how family has a certain vibe, like a consciousness, and it's very like we don't. They feel threatened, and it's not a bad thing. And I had to go through this myself because I love how you're like you go away for a year and you're like, holy cow, things change. That was me twice.
Yeah.
I did it one time, and I was like, wow, I'm going through a lot of change. I'm seeing things different, which was just me being allowed to be expressing myself and who I am. And then the same thing happened when I went to chiropractic school. And then, but it is tough because I know for myself and working with others, like when I've worked with clients and they want to make a change, and all of a sudden their family will be like, wait a minute here, or what about this? Or why don't you think this? And I'm always like, careful. They may be putting their fears and putting them on you, not doing it on purpose. They love you. Trust me, they wouldn't do that, but they don't realize that they're doing that. And so then all of a sudden, that's what happened to me when I wanted to start out my business, and I had nothing. I was in the negative with school, and I went in the negative just to be like, all right, I'm going to try to make this work. And my parents like, no, why don't you go work with so-and-so? It's more secure. It's more comfortable. We know the person. They'll take good care of you. And I'm like, for what I'm getting paid compared to what my vision is and what I want to do, and it wasn't about the money. It was more about me wanting to just be me. I like to be me and just let me be me. And so I find that fascinating. So that's pretty interesting there. Would you say, and I know we're talking about time bombs and different times in life relating to parents, what about just your normal life? Is there certain things at certain ages? Because like for me, looking at the brain, like we really don't become the prefrontal cortex part of the brain doesn't really fully develop to around about 25. And so I always joke with like someone's trying to make decisions. Like I laugh at myself now back in my early 20s when I thought I knew everything. And I'm like, yeah, you didn't know jack, buddy. I don't know why you even thought that. You couldn't even make a decision and think into the future and see how I did a little bit, but my impulse control, all that was not at the level where it is today. And a lot of times it's because of that prefrontal cortex area. Does that play a role in a lot of the work that you do?
Yes, it absolutely does. So tracking all of these people's lives, 500,000 of them, I would then sort of take these charts back and kind of look at them. And it fell into roughly a 7-year cycle of life, which wasn't an idea I started out with. So the data actually suggested that this was the pattern. And then I became aware, of course, that almost every civilization, every culture, every religion's had pretty much the same idea. It's one of those common ideas that about every 7 years you get a chance to reorient or reconsider your life in a fairly dramatic way. So if we talk about that sort of early adulthood, then you kind of have this phase really between about 21 and 28. You're sort of wandering around trying to get a grip on what the heck life is. It's often quite anxiety provoking, really. You're supposed to be kind of cool and partying and having a great wild time, but actually it's much more apprehensive than it's commonly portrayed. And then I reckon your 29th year really starts with some theme music, and that's the umbilical cord breaking completely separate. And so, but after 29, you can't really blame your parents anymore. It's just not fair. You've got to be, you're on your own, buddy. And what's interesting, I think, during the 20s, you're trying to work out what's my contribution? Where can I place myself? Now, between 29 and 36, I ended up calling this the Napoleon years. After Napoleon sort of, I've got to get to Moscow, didn't work out so well, he comes back. Okay. So essentially what happens, around 29, you grab an idea. This is it. I've got the mission. I've got the calling. I've got the thing I'm going to do, right? And then, but you're a bit like somebody who's got a hammer and everything's a nail. So this is the same solution. I'm just going to be this. I'm going to start this career. I'm being in this relationship, and it's going to be fantastic. And then often by the age of 36, you look back and go, hang on. There's actually more diversity to me and to life than really I thought of when I was 29. So that's when you start to broaden out again. So it's interesting to see these common themes that occur across people's lives. Not necessarily because I will accurately describe every individual life. That would be fanciful and silly. But to think about what lots of people do at different phases of life then helps you to kind of think about, well, what do I want for my life? What sort of things should I prioritize? Because really life does require different things of you at different stages. And so you need to modify what you're doing in order to maximize your outcomes and your contribution and your resilience, really. And I guess we all know that because we probably have all met people who at, say, 46 are still doing the same stuff they were doing at 16, and it just doesn't look that pretty, really. It's not, it's past its use by date. And so they've never taken the time to reflect or to reinvent themselves. And so they're pretty much like a 16-year-old growing, walking around a 46-year-old body, but not such a good look.
How much then too, because I've heard this before in the past, like sometimes if you don't heal from something emotionally at a certain age, emotionally you get trapped back there until you heal that. Is that kind of accurate, or is that just a cute little, kind of phrase and saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not. I mean, certainly there's scar tissue. I mean, I've seen people that have had, as you have, I'm sure, have had dreadful experiences, and the scar tissue that they form around it can be even stronger than the original wounding area. So it's not always a bad thing to be wounded, even though I wouldn't say it's a lot of fun. But at the same time, it'll make you tougher. But it can. You got to be careful that you don't kind of just stop in time then with your own survival strategy, because survival strategies are incredibly compelling. So if I basically got through a really tough time by being incredibly self-reliant and not trusting anybody else, but basically relying on my own wits and never asking other people for help because I'm a really kind of tough, independent kind of guy, well, it's not going to work forever. You've got to then kind of reshape yourself and go, winning strategy now, but maybe not the winning strategy I want to use throughout my life. Otherwise, I'll end up lonely and fairly kind of isolated as a person. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. And then what about in the 40s? Is there anything you've noticed with your work into the 40s? Because I feel like a lot of times when I look at people, a lot of my mentors, 40 was like their launching pad years, where all of a sudden there's just a different shift in them. They're more in sync with themselves and the work that they're doing, and a lot of times they're more successful, and that's where their like success really blossomed. And I don't mean that just from a financial standpoint. I'm just talking about in life in general. I would notice a lot of them around the 40s is where it would happen. And I know in my work, I know 40 is like that beautiful midline point of the max of the physical body, and then the mind continues to develop as we get older. But the physical body, your peak is right around 40. Well, I shouldn't say peak. Your before we start have to work on that to keep it there now is around 40, because now the challenge starts to happen where you got to work a little harder to maintain things. But is there something about in your work that you've seen over 500,000 people working with? What is there any patterns in the 40s that happen?
Yeah, the 40s are a fascinating time. I mean, biologically, most of the bits are in the right place. You're still looking fantastic pretty much, but you're incredibly industrious. Now, Carl Jung once said that more people enter therapy at the age of 49 than any other. And I started to think about that and notice it, and it's right. So after a period of being industrious and successful and so on, people become devoted to it. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, they fly, but they're often at the same time, if they're tending to relationships, tending to careers, some are raising kids, some are looking after older parents. So I ended up calling the sort of 40s this holding the tiger by the tail phase of life. And so it's like you've got this tiger and you're holding it by its tail, but if I let go of the tail, I'm in big trouble, right? So they're clinging on, right? And they work hard, really hard. And then at the age of 49, if they've done that, and they can grow incredibly, and I would say generally women possibly grow even faster than men at that stage. So it can be a time of peril for relationships where one partner can kind of leap further ahead than the other, and that can cause some relationship peril. But by the age of 49, quite often people look in the mirror and go, well, that was great and I'm successful, but where did I go in the midst of it all? And that then kicks off a change, a really substantial change in people's lives between 49 and 56. And that's a hard slog, because what's been, again, that winning strategy of being really successful and working hard and acquiring, more goods and more knowledge and so on, it requires then the next shift. So between 49 and 56, I ended up calling the agony and the ecstasy. So this is a time of life when the angels and the demons both come out to play in people's lives. And it's a time of bewilderment. So the 40s that we've just been talking about are a time of great certainty. I know my job, I know my contribution, and I'm gunning it, right? And then what happens is, often between that next phase of life, that next 7-year cycle, it's thrown out of whack again. And I'm just completely uncertain. I'm bewildered. I don't know quite what I'm doing. My past strategies have passed their use by date. I now need to invent something useful. Now, our world has very little tolerance for uncertain people. We don't value hesitancy or caution much. We don't really think people who say, well, I'm not sure what I'm doing with my life. And so quite often we rush off and try and medicate them. Whereas this is a rite of passage. Now, rites of passage have been written about by, Homer, by Dante. There are all sorts of examples in human literature. And so you enter you move away from your former life, and you enter a phase of betwixt and between, all at sea, completely confused. And being able to tolerate that rather than to medicate it means that gives you the facility to reinvent the next part of life. But if you don't do that, if you rush and try and dampen it all down, or basically use the old strategies, you can end up in a lot of bother for yourself. One of the classic errors that I've watched lots and lots of people do at this stage of life is because they feel physiologically discomforted within themselves. They're basically a bit agitated, they're uncertain, they think they shouldn't be uncertain. And the tendency can be to then project it onto somebody else and say, well, it's your fault. I'm feeling this way. We're over, we're done. And okay, some relationships do run at a puff, of course, as we know, but really the way out of this phase is in. You need to kind of go into yourself and reflect and go, okay, now I'm all grown up. Who am I going to be? What am I going to do next? And that's a really exciting prospect if you can take the time to bear with it and have people not hurry you into a solution that's false.
I like that. That makes a lot of sense. Is that also why a lot of times around the 50-year mark, a lot of midlife crises kick in for some people?
Yep. That's exactly it. And so, and unless there's a reason why that's there. And because we do need to invent a different self to carry us through the second half of life. And if we don't do that, we just basically keep the old patterns happening, or we just start to wither. And we watch some people become prematurely aged at that point. So it can be a time to be really aware if there are time bombs in your family about people getting ill, or people getting frail, or people not looking out for themselves, or being kind of wasteful in terms of their own resources in their early 50s, or splitting up, of course, are all kind of time bombs that are worth just listening out for and learning about and going, do I want to do that or not?
And you got me curious now too, like even divorces and stuff. I wonder, like if we look at all the divorces, where's the majority of them fall in, at what age bracket? I'd be curious to see that.
So there's
go ahead.
Sorry, there's some that occur very quickly in relationships that are just ill-suited, but the vast bulk are in that 49 to 56 bandwidth. Yeah, that's when people run out of puff with themselves, but also with each other, I think.
And can you go through, because I went through something in my life at, was it 33, 32? No, 32, 33. I think it was was it 5 years ago? So 33, where I started to look. I got the success I wanted.
Mm.
Everything was going well, but then, and I knew my vision, everything was crystal clear. I made a whole shift in no, everything was going well. And all of a sudden I was just like, this is not, if this is all it is, then I'm not happy with this. Like I finally got to that level and then I'm like, this is not rewarding. Like, yeah, the money's doing well. I'm helping a lot of people, but I wasn't doing it in the way that I wanted to like make a dent to help humanity move forward. And can those things happen earlier too, or is it more like that was just me making a career, getting more focused in what I'm doing in my 29 to 36 range, rather than what I'm going to be experiencing when I get to that 49, 56 area?
I think there's a period, yes, in that early 30s where often you do become disenchanted or disillusioned with what you've selected. And I guess that's why I called it the Napoleon years, because that's exactly what happened to Napoleon during that time, thinking about Moscow and retreating from it, which was disastrous. But in a way, sometimes it's our times of disillusionment that contain the seeds of the next innovation. And so it's not, while it feels incredibly unpleasant and difficult and, I should know what I'm doing and all of that kind of stuff, why does this feel empty, even though it's on the level it's been successful? It's because really there's an inner calling within you, I think, to bring out the contribution that only really you can make. And if you don't realize that, then it becomes problematic in your life. There's a book by James Hillman called The Soul's Code, which I really like. And basically the concept of basically that all of us have a sort of almost a fate or a daemon, I think he calls it, where, we have a contribution to make. And if you don't realize that, it's very difficult to have a fulfilling life. And so we do spend a lot of our times in our lives trying to work out what that contribution is and how to make it, I think. And we know when it's right. And we also know quite in an agitated way when it's not right too.
Yeah, and it's beautiful. Like it's like I always tell people, like we all, we all have this like reason why we're here, and it's twofold. I always tell people, like one is to gain experiences. That's the purpose of it. The second, though, is what are you giving that uniqueness of what you have in that no one else has to the world. And I love that because it's kind of like a seed where it's been planted in you, and it's your job to like, all right, where is that? How are we going to cultivate that seed to wake it up, and so forth. I can talk a whole podcast on that, but I like that. The next thing I'm curious to ask is because I've experienced this with my grandfather, and when I'm Italian, my grandfather was from Italy, my dad's from Italy. I'm a 1.5 Italian generation because my mom's born in America. But long story short, he was a very hard, very strict, strong, just he fit the Italian man mindset. This is how I say it, and that's it. I'm the boss, and that's the end of it, all that kind of stuff. But as he got older, him and our relationship really prospered as I got older, and he became very softer. And in a lot of different ways. I mean, he had a lot of guilt in him. He would always tell me, "Don't be a dummy like me." And I used to yell at him, "You came with nothing, and you made massive success at one point." Again, he was kind of followed my, this is my mom's dad, not my dad's, but same thing with my dad. Dad, massive success, gone. Him, massive success, gone. Same reasons. And it was one of those things where he got softer as he got older. My dad's 70 right now, and I'm starting to experience that with him, which is kind of shocking. My dad will talk to me more now, and I'm always like, this is weird. He'll share stories and share like wisdom his dad gave him. I'm going, hold up, he's never talked to me about this on anything. So it's kind of hard. I don't want to have that knee-jerk reaction. So I'm always like, I got to take this in. This is what you always wanted. Now just embrace this and enjoy this part. But why does that happen? I mean, I understand from a physiological side, neurological side, there's a lot of things that go on, even biologically. But I'm curious to see with all the stuff you've been doing and why you talk about, I think I read that you're talking a little bit about like 70 is the years to when you learn to be a friend with yourself. If you don't mind diving in with that.
Yeah, so I think that quite often for all of us, there are certain questions that predominate and dictate our lives to us. And that might be, how do I raise a family, or how do I get smart, or how do I be successful, or whatever it might be. But there's another sort of 7 questions or so, it doesn't, not the set number, but that gets suppressed So their questions that basically get killed off a bit early by the domination of these other 7 questions. And then you get to a point where you're able, if you're wise, to leave the battlefield of the life that you've led. So it doesn't mean you stop being successful, but it's not a competitive life. It becomes a more collaborative one. And so in some ways that allows you to have those other questions, the softer questions often, the ones that are less pressing in terms of the demand of success. How do I become a good friend? How do I enjoy the history of my life, the people, and things like that come up, which is often why people go, and start to look at their ancestry and family patterns and things like that, because they're suddenly interested much more in the relational aspects of life. And it's a great thing to watch in a man who's lived in a hard way, to acquaint himself and integrate his softer, more creative side, because he's really becoming a more wholehearted person. Whereas when he's that hard guy who's really kind of fierce, he's only half of what he can be, really. And it's a cover job too. And it costs him. So if you never actually soften and become more creative and gentle in your world, I guess they're the guys who run into risk of, heart attack and kind of major illness, because they've never quite balanced themselves back again. It's okay to do it for a short period of your life if you really have to combat to basically be successful. But then you don't want to end up thinking, I'm just my job.
Yeah, you're nailing it right on the head. I mean, and it's interesting too that when you have that person who's really hard and firm and all that, and then you see that softening. Where I love how you said, this is what I always say. Like, there's, if you're very too dominant masculine energy, or just too much on that other side, the feminine happens later in life, and it's one of those things where it allows you to be more whole. And it was very fascinating to see that in my grandfather, in his process, because it was just like, wow, we're having conversations. He's telling me about his life. He's sharing stories and wisdoms and things he learned as when he was younger. And I can ask questions like, hey, how was it coming from Italy with nothing? And someone had to pay your way. And you had this little bit of money. You had someone who helped you out. And next thing you know, you created what you did. That took a lot of courage. You left all the family to do that. Because now I want to learn from him. How did he do that? Because that's a huge risk. I mean, nowadays we're like, oh, you just jump on a plane, you can go there, and social media, internet. I mean, the things are a lot easier nowadays. I'm like, yeah, back then there's nothing. You go to a foreign place, you don't know anybody. There's no like a lot of connections. I mean, there was Italians, where a lot of them were moving in the area where he moved, but yeah, I think that's it's pretty interesting. Does mortality play a role? Like, as they know their end is coming, does that also play a role on them too? That kind of opens up that softness.
I'm not sure whether it's driven by mortality. I think that sometimes I'll see men have a misguided affair around 50 to try to they believe they're Peter Pan, they're never growing old, and they're basically trying to almost prove how youthful and desirable they are, which generally works out really badly. But anyway, that's a whole other story. But I think that if we look at I know you've got Italian heritage, but the ancient Greeks talked about masculine and feminine in a really interesting way, because the feminine was Sophia, which was wisdom, whereas masculine was equated with kindness. And we don't think about that in the modern world, but actually what we do see in good men is they become substantially kinder as they acquaint themselves with that other part of themselves as they mature. They ripen into themselves in a way that's delightful. They get a twinkle in their eye, there's more humor, there's more fun, and I think they just connect in a really great way. And I think that's probably what you're experiencing.
Totally, 100%. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I never knew about the masculine side being kind. That's a new one for me. So I appreciate you sharing that. So with your book and everything, how can people, connect, find out more about this, everything we're talking about, and all the work you're doing and everything else?
So Your Best Life at Any Age is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all that kind of, those all good and hopefully not so good bookshops, I don't know. I guess, that are around. There's also a couple of websites that I run. One is called andrewfuller.com.au. The .au is the Australian part of it, and that's there's a whole lot of free downloads of things, different papers on depression proofing people and anxiety and preparing for tests and exams for kids and that kind of stuff. That's quite useful. And there's also a website that I've set up last year called mylearningstrengths.com. mylearningstrengths.com is where you can go on, and there's a great photo of me, by the way. I spent a lot of money on that photo. I look terrific, and so admire the photo, please. And then you can do an analysis of your learning strengths for free, and you get a letter from me that says, congratulations, Vic, you're really good at this and this, but if you want to get better in another area, here's a way of doing it. And the reason I did that was I was designed originally for school age students, but I was trying to think about most young people don't get to hear about what they're good at from someone who's neither their teacher nor their parent. And 27,000 young people around the world have done it in the year that it's been up. And it's some lovely feedback from young people and adults as well who've been doing it. So and there's also free downloads there as well if you want to have a look at them.
Awesome. For the listeners, that will be all in the show notes for you to grab and get a hold of. Andrew, this was awesome. I really appreciate having you on. I appreciate you sharing your wisdom and allowing me to share a little bit of some personal stuff with you to just dissect a little bit for me, but at the same token, also to connect, just to share to the listeners, listen to, something personal from me on that level and kind of break that down. So I love the work you're doing, brother. Keep rocking and rolling. And thanks for taking the time to be on.
Thank you. It's been a delight, this conversation. So I really appreciate it. And thanks for being so sharing about your family. Really interesting stuff, isn't it?
It's amazing. I appreciate that, brother.